Thunder rumbled as the billionaire froze in place. Across the grand hall, the homeless woman clutched a faded photo, his missing daughter. Tears streaked her face. His chest tightened. How did she know his daughter? And why was she crying? The storm had raged for hours, battering against the iron gates of the estate, rattling the towering glass windows like an omen. Inside, the billionaire sat in the dim glow of his study, fingers idly tracing the worn edges of an old locket. The gold had dulled over the years, its delicate chain tangled beyond repair. Inside was a picture, faded, creased at the corners, a little girl with wide, trusting eyes. His daughter. Or at least the girl she had been before she disappeared 15 years ago. Before the fight. Before the unbearable silence. Before his world had hollowed into endless wealth and nothingness. Leonard Whitmore had built his empire from the ground up, carving his name into the financial world with ruthless precision. Yet, for all his power, he had never managed to reclaim what mattered most. Her. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, indifferent to his pain. The echoes of his own failings stretched through the cavernous mansion, weaving between the antique furniture and oil paintings, relics of a dynasty that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. He had designed every inch of this place to be impenetrable, yet its vastness swallowed him whole. His staff had long since retired for the night, the usual hum of service silenced by the storm. Alone, he stared into the whiskey glass, the amber liquid reflecting his tired eyes. Had she forgiven him? Had she even survived? Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the estate's wrought iron gates. A figure, barely visible through the downpour, clutched the hand of a small child. Leonard sat up, heart pounding. No one approached Whitmore Manor. No one dared. He set down the locket, its broken chain slipping between his fingers. Something inside him shifted, an instinct, long buried under wealth and cynicism, whispering that fate had just knocked on his door. The knocking came in frantic bursts. Leonard hesitated. How many years had passed since someone had stood on his doorstep, seeking anything other than business or greed? He pressed his palms to the desk, pushing himself to his feet. His knees ached, reminders of a body that had aged while his mind remained shackled to the past. He reached the grand entrance, hesitating before the massive double doors. Through the glass panes, he could just make out the figures, a woman, her hair plastered to her face, clutching the shoulders of a small boy. They were drenched, shivering, desperate. A memory stirred. His daughter, soaked from the rain, standing in this very spot all those years ago. Her face streaked with anger and betrayal. "You don't see me. You only see what you want me to be." He shook the thought away and pulled open the door. The woman gasped at the warmth of the mansion's interior, her arms instinctively tightening around the boy. Her eyes flickered up to his, haunted, familiar, filled with something he couldn't name. "Please," she whispered, her voice raw. "Just for tonight." Leonard didn't ask questions. He simply stepped aside, allowing them in, never realizing that this single act of kindness would unravel the secrets of his past and change everything. As they stepped inside, the woman hesitated, her eyes scanning the opulent hallway. Her hands trembled, gripping the boy's coat tighter. The child, no older than 6, peered up at Leonard with wide, unblinking eyes. There was something eerily familiar about them. The heavy door groaned as Leonard shut it, sealing them inside. The storm howled against the windows, but inside, a different kind of tension thickened the air. He gestured toward the sitting room, unsure of what else to do. "You can dry off in there." The woman hesitated before nodding. "Thank you." She led the boy into the room, her posture stiff, guarded. Leonard followed, watching as she knelt before the fireplace, holding her hands out to the warmth. The firelight flickered across her face, illuminating the exhaustion etched into her features. "What's your name?" Leonard finally asked, breaking the silence. She exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the boy's shoulders. "Evelyn." He waited, expecting her to offer more. When she didn't, his gaze flickered to the child. "And him?" She hesitated. Michael. Leonard nodded, the names rolling through his mind like whispers from a past he couldn't place. The boy fidgeted under his scrutiny, pressing closer to Evelyn. "Are you in trouble?" he asked, though the answer was already clear in their wary expressions. Evelyn swallowed hard. "We just needed somewhere safe for the night. We'll leave by morning." Leonard studied her face, his instinct stirring again. There was something about her, about the way she looked at him, something unsettlingly familiar. And then he noticed it, the way her gaze flickered to the locket still resting on the table. Her breath hitched. Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, tears welled in her eyes, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the small photograph inside. Leonard's chest constricted. The storm outside seemed to fade, silence stretching between them like a chasm. "What do you know about my daughter?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn choked back a sob. "Because," she whispered, "I think I knew her." The room closed in around him. The air thickened, suffocating. His pulse thundered as realization loomed over him, dark and undeniable. 15 years. Gone. And yet, somehow the past had found its way back to him. Leonard's fingers curled around the armrest of his chair as he fought to steady his breath. Evelyn's eyes, red-rimmed, brimming with ghosts, held his in a silent plea. The small boy, Michael, clung to her side, watching with quiet intensity, as if sensing the weight of the moment. The rain had softened into a gentle patter against the windows, but inside the mansion, the storm still raged. "How?" Leonard's voice came hoarse, nearly unrecognizable. Evelyn blinked, her lips pressing together as if she was swallowing back something painful. "She was my friend," she finally said. "A long time ago." Leonard stiffened. His mind spun, sifting through memories like shattered glass. "You knew my daughter?" Evelyn nodded, then reached into the pocket of her tattered coat. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out a crumpled photograph. She smoothed it against her palm, hesitating before holding it out to him. Leonard took it, his pulse hammering. The image was old, weathered, but unmistakable. His daughter, standing beside another girl, both smiling beneath the golden glow of a summer sky. His grip tightened around the photo. Where was this taken?" Evelyn's voice was barely above a whisper. "The last place I saw her before she disappeared." The air in the room shifted. Leonard's heart clenched. He had spent years searching, following false leads, battling the torment of unanswered questions. And now, a stranger, drenched, weary, and carrying secrets, had walked into his home with a connection to the very past he had been chasing. Leonard's grip on the photograph tightened as Evelyn wiped at her damp cheeks. "Where did you see her last?" he asked, his voice a strained whisper. Evelyn hesitated before speaking. "It was years ago, but I remember the night clearly. She had come to me, afraid and desperate, saying she couldn't go home." Leonard's breath hitched. "Why?" "She was running from something. Someone," Evelyn admitted, her voice barely audible over the fire's crackling. "She never told me who, only that she couldn't go back." Leonard's pulse pounded in his ears. He had always assumed she had left because of their argument. But now a new horror dawned. Was someone else responsible for her disappearance? Michael shifted uneasily, his small fingers clutching his mother's coat. Evelyn noticed and pulled the boy closer, as though shielding him from the weight of the conversation. Leonard's gaze darkened. "Do you know where she went after that?" Evelyn looked away, shame flickering across her face. "I tried to help her. I really did. But she disappeared that same night. I never saw her again." A heavy silence settled between them. Leonard could feel the air tighten, thick with grief and unanswered questions. He had spent years searching, hiring investigators, following dead-end leads, blaming himself, only to discover there was more to the story than he had ever imagined. He inhaled sharply, steeling himself. "Then we need to find out what really happened." Leonard's knuckles whitened as he clutched the photograph Evelyn had handed him. His daughter's face, young and hopeful, stared back at him from the past, frozen in time. He swallowed the lump in his throat and forced himself to ask, "What happened to her?" Evelyn hesitated, her fingers twisting in her lap. She was scared. She told me someone was following her. She begged me not to tell anyone where she was. Leonard's breath caught. Did she say who? Evelyn shook her head. She wouldn't say a name, but she was terrified. I let her stay with me that night. The next morning, she was gone. The words sliced through Leonard like a blade. He had believed for so long that she had left because of their fight. But now it seemed something far more sinister had been at play. Did you ever see her again? Evelyn's eyes filled with regret. Number I looked for her, asked around, but she had vanished. Leonard rose abruptly, pacing the length of the room. There has to be something we're missing, he muttered, something that connects all of this. His eyes landed on Michael, who was clutching a small, worn-out teddy bear. How do you fit into this? Evelyn tensed. He's my son, she said quickly. Leonard frowned. There was something in the way she said it, something defensive, guarded. And then it hit him, the boy's eyes, wide, familiar, too familiar. His heart pounded. Evelyn, who is his father? Leonard's mind raced. His hands trembled as he set the photograph down. You think you knew her? He repeated, barely able to control the tremor in his voice. Evelyn nodded, her gaze dropping. She was my friend. A long time ago. Leonard took a deep breath, steadying himself. Tell me everything. Evelyn hesitated before speaking. We met in a shelter. She never told me much about her past, but I knew she was running from something. She never said what. Leonard's stomach tightened. Did she ever mention me? Evelyn exhaled sharply. Number. But she was always looking over her shoulder. I knew someone had hurt her. Michael shifted beside her, his small hands clutching the worn-out teddy bear tighter. Leonard's gaze flickered to him. And Michael? Evelyn hesitated, then whispered, He's her son. The air seemed to shatter. Leonard's pulse roared in his ears. His knees nearly buckled. He stared at the boy with his daughter's eyes. His voice cracked. Michael, is my grandson? Evelyn nodded, tears streaming down her face. I tried to protect him, but now I don't know who to trust. Leonard clenched his fists. Then we will find out together. The storm outside raged on, but inside, a new storm was brewing. One that would change everything. Leonard's mind was a storm of disbelief and rage. His hands shook as he gripped the locket tighter, his knuckles turning white. You knew her? His voice came out in a whisper, but it was laced with a desperate demand. Evelyn nodded slowly, fresh tears glistening in her eyes. She was my friend. My best friend. His breath hitched, chest tightening as if the air had been stolen from the room. Then why didn't you tell me sooner? Evelyn flinched. Because I was afraid, she admitted, voice barely audible. Afraid of what you might do. Afraid that if you knew the truth, it would destroy you. Leonard felt like the ground beneath him was crumbling. He had spent years searching for his daughter, drowning in guilt and unanswered questions, only to discover that someone had known the truth all along, and yet she had kept it from him. Destroy me? His voice cracked with emotion. I lost my daughter. I have lived in the shadows of my mistakes, tormented by what I could have done differently. And you? You kept this from me? Evelyn recoiled as though struck. I thought I was protecting her. Leonard shook his head, stepping back as a cold realization washed over him. No, he murmured, his voice hollow. You were protecting yourself. Leonard turned away from Evelyn, his breath shallow, his thoughts racing. The room, once a sanctuary of solitude, now felt like a cage, its walls closing in around him. He had spent years yearning for answers, chasing shadows, only to learn that the truth had been within reach all along, hidden behind the guarded gaze of the woman standing before him. Evelyn's silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. She clutched her hands together, her knuckles white, as though bracing for the inevitable storm. "Leonard," she murmured, her voice trembling, "I didn't mean to hurt you." He spun to face her, eyes burning with unspoken anguish. "You didn't mean to hurt me?" His voice was raw, laced with incredulity. "Do you have any idea what you've done? What you've kept from me?" Evelyn's gaze flickered to Michael, who stood between them, his small hands gripping the hem of his mother's coat. The boy's wide, questioning eyes darted from Leonard to Evelyn, sensing the weight of the moment but too young to understand its gravity. Leonard's chest tightened. He took a shaky breath, forcing himself to focus. "Tell me everything," he said, his tone leaving no room for evasion. "Right now." Evelyn hesitated, then exhaled, shoulders slumping. "I met your daughter when we were both just teenagers," she admitted. She was kind, strong-willed, but she carried pain inside her that she rarely spoke of. She loved you, Leonard, but she felt trapped. Leonard clenched his jaw, his mind flashing back to old arguments, to the last time he had seen her, the way her eyes had brimmed with resentment. "I only wanted what was best for her," he whispered, more to himself than to Evelyn. "She didn't see it that way," Evelyn said gently. "She felt suffocated by your expectations, your need to control everything. The night she left, she told me she couldn't go back." Leonard's breath caught in his throat. The years of searching, the sleepless nights spent wondering where she had gone. Had she truly chosen to disappear? Had he been the reason? Evelyn's eyes glistened. "But she didn't just vanish, Leonard. She was running. From someone." The room seemed to darken. "Who?" Evelyn swallowed hard. "She never told me his name, only that she was afraid of him." Leonard's pulse roared in his ears. All these years he had assumed his daughter had left because of him. The guilt had eaten away at him, poisoned his every thought. But now, a new horror loomed. Had she been in danger all along? He gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. "And Michael?" His voice was barely audible. For years he had mourned the past, dwelling in his regrets, believing himself powerless to change what had already been lost. But now, for the first time in years, he saw a path forward. He turned to Evelyn, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "We will." The wind howled around them, but inside, the smallest ember of hope had been rekindled. The night was dark, but dawn was coming. The night stretched endlessly, a void of silence and shadow that swallowed everything in its path. Leonard stood alone on the mansion's grand balcony, his eyes lost in the vast expanse of the stormy night. The wind howled through the skeletal trees, bending their limbs as if in silent mourning. Below, the driveway shimmered under the rain, its puddles reflecting the broken fragments of moonlight. Pieces of a world he no longer recognized. His daughter had been running. From someone, and he had spent years believing she had run from him. He pressed his palms against the cold iron railing, gripping it as if it were the only thing tethering him to reality. His mind reeled, playing back every memory of her, the laughter, the fights, the bitter silence that stretched between them in the end. He had convinced himself that his money, his power, could fix anything. But it had never been enough to keep her safe. Had he failed her? Had he let her disappear into the night, not realizing the danger that awaited her? Inside, the mansion loomed like a mausoleum, filled with echoes of a life he had built but never truly lived. The weight of his loneliness settled into his bones, colder than the wind whipping through his coat. He had built these walls to keep people out, to create a kingdom where no one could hurt him again. And yet, it had only turned into his prison. He closed his eyes, listening to the storm. His mind was a tempest of its own, memories colliding with regrets. The argument that had sent her away all those years ago resurfaced, raw and unrelenting. "You don't control me, Dad. I only want what's best for you. What's best for me, or what makes you feel like you're in charge?" You think the world is kind, but it isn't. I need to protect you. Maybe I don't want your protection. And then she was gone. He had told himself it was her choice, that she would come back when she was ready. But what if she had wanted to come back? What if she had tried, only to be met with something far worse than his expectations? The thought sent a shudder down his spine. A creak echoed behind him. He turned sharply, his heart pounding, to find Evelyn standing in the doorway. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her posture hesitant. She didn't have to speak. He could see the burden weighing on her, the same loss mirrored in her own gaze. She trusted me, Evelyn finally said, stepping onto the balcony. But I couldn't protect her. Leonard turned back to the darkness, his grip on the railing tightening. Neither could I. The silence between them stretched, not hostile, but heavy with understanding. They were two people bound by loss, by a shared failure that neither could erase. Evelyn reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. She hesitated, then handed it to him. I found this in her things before she disappeared. Leonard unfolded the note carefully. The ink was smudged, the edges worn. His breath caught as he read the words. I thought I was safe. I was wrong. If anything happens to me, tell my father I tried to come home. His vision blurred, his breath hitching in his throat. The world around him tilted, but he forced himself to steady. She had tried. She had reached for him, and he hadn't been there. Evelyn's voice was barely above a whisper. We have to find out what happened to her. Leonard exhaled shakily, folding the note with careful precision. The grief inside him was a living thing, pressing against his ribs, threatening to consume him. But beneath it, something else stirred. Something stronger. Resolve. Evelyn hesitated before answering. He's your grandson, Leonard. The words slammed into him like a physical blow. He stared at the boy, at the unmistakable resemblance, the familiar curve of his cheek, the eyes that mirrored his daughter's. My grandson, he whispered. Michael looked up at him with innocent curiosity, oblivious to the weight of the revelation. Leonard turned back to Evelyn, his voice trembling. Why didn't you tell me? Tears slipped down Evelyn's cheeks. Because I was scared. I didn't know who to trust, and I didn't know if you'd believe me. Leonard let out a shaky breath, the past and present colliding in his mind. He had spent years believing he had lost everything, only to realize that his daughter had left behind something, someone worth fighting for. He dropped to one knee before Michael, his voice gentle. I didn't know, he admitted. I didn't know about you. Michael blinked up at him, uncertain. Slowly he released his grip on Evelyn's coat and took a small step forward. Leonard's throat tightened. He reached out, his hand trembling, and rested it on the boy's shoulder. A lifetime of regret welled up inside him, but with it came something else, something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. He looked up at Evelyn, his voice steady now. We need to find out what happened to her. Evelyn nodded, determination shining through her tears. Yes, we do. Leonard rose to his feet, his grief transforming into resolve. His daughter's story wasn't over, and neither was his. Leonard's hands trembled as he gripped the note tighter. The words burned into his mind, igniting something deep within him, something primal, something furious. His daughter had tried to return to him, but something had stopped her. And now, after all these years, he finally had a chance to uncover the truth. The mansion's grandeur felt suffocating, its walls no longer a fortress, but a prison of memories and regrets. He turned to Evelyn, his eyes hardened with determination. Where do we start? She hesitated only a moment before pulling a worn envelope from her coat pocket. There's one name that kept coming up when she spoke of her fears. A man named Victor Langley. The name was unfamiliar, but something about it sent a chill through Leonard's spine. He took the envelope from Evelyn and slid out a tattered photograph. A man stood beside his daughter, his hand gripping her wrist too tightly, his smile forced. Leonard's blood ran cold. Who is he? Evelyn shook her head. I don't know exactly. But I think he was the one she was running from. Leonard's hands curled into fists. Years of regret, years of mourning, years of believing he had lost her by his own doing. It had all been a lie. Someone had stolen her from him, and now, after all this time, he was going to get her back. Or at least find out what had happened to her. "We find Langley," he said, voice like steel. "And we make him talk." Hours later, Leonard and Evelyn found themselves in the heart of the city, standing before a decrepit warehouse on the outskirts of an industrial district. The air was thick with the stench of oil and rust, the streets eerily quiet at this late hour. Evelyn adjusted her coat, glancing around cautiously. "Are you sure about this?" Leonard nodded, his jaw set. "I've never been more sure." He pushed open the heavy metal door, the hinges screeching in protest. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, shadows stretching along the concrete walls. Crates were stacked high, dust and neglect coating every surface. A figure stood near the far end of the room, casually leaning against an old wooden desk. Victor Langley. He was older than in the photograph, but the arrogance in his posture remained unchanged. His eyes flickered between Leonard and Evelyn, a slow smirk curling his lips. "Well, well," he drawled. "Didn't expect visitors at this hour?" Leonard strode forward, his voice a low growl. "You know why we're here." Langley chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, I imagine I do. But tell me, what makes you think you'll like the answers you find?" Evelyn stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "You were the last person seen with her." Langley sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "And what if I was?" Leonard's patience snapped. He grabbed Langley by the collar, slamming him against the desk. The smirk fell from Langley's face, replaced with a flicker of something else. Concern. "You took her," Leonard hissed. "Where is she?" Langley held up his hands, feigning innocence. Now, let's not be hasty." Leonard tightened his grip. "Start talking." Langley chuckled again, but there was an edge of nervousness beneath it. All right, he muttered, adjusting his shirt as Leonard finally let go. "She came to me for help. She was scared, desperate. Said she needed a way out." Leonard's heart clenched. "Out of what?" Langley shrugged. "Whatever mess she'd gotten herself into. She was being watched. She was terrified." Evelyn's breath hitched. "And you just let her disappear?" Langley hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "She didn't disappear." His voice dropped to a whisper. "She was taken." Silence crashed over them like a wave. Leonard felt the room tilt, his vision blurring. His daughter had been taken, stolen from him while he had sat in his mansion, convinced she had simply chosen to leave. Evelyn found her voice first. "Who took her?" Langley's expression darkened. "People you don't want to cross." Leonard's pulse pounded. "Where is she?" Langley hesitated. "I don't know." Leonard lunged again, but this time Langley didn't flinch. "I don't know," he repeated, "but I might know who does." Leonard stepped back, his mind racing. The rage inside him boiled hotter, but beneath it was something even more potent. Hope. Leonard clenched his fists, his breathing ragged. "Who?" Langley smirked, shaking his head. "I can't say." Leonard growled, reaching for him again, but Evelyn stepped between them. "Think, Langley," she said, her voice urgent. "You know what they're capable of. If she was taken, there's a reason. Help us and maybe you'll live to see another day." Langley exhaled sharply, running a hand through his graying hair. He knew they weren't bluffing. Finally, he muttered, "There's an estate. West of the river. That's where they take the ones who don't cooperate." Leonard and Evelyn exchanged a glance. Without another word, they turned and strode out of the warehouse. The storm had returned, rain slicing through the night as they drove toward the estate. The tension was suffocating, but neither spoke. They both knew. This was it. As the estate loomed ahead, Leonard tightened his grip on the wheel. His daughter was here. He could feel it, and this time he would not fail her. He would not. The estate was eerily silent in the aftermath. The confrontation had ended, the ghosts of the past exorcised in the cold light of dawn. Leonard stood on the front steps, his hands trembling at his sides, staring at the worn path leading away from the towering gates. He had found her. His daughter was alive. She was inside, resting, her body battered but intact, her spirit fragile yet unbroken. The weight of years had lifted, but in its place was something heavier: responsibility. The search had ended, but the journey to healing had only begun. Evelyn stepped beside him, her arms wrapped around herself against the morning chill. "You did it," she said softly. "You found her." Leonard exhaled, the breath unsteady. "I don't know if I did anything at all." Evelyn gave him a knowing look. "You never gave up. That's more than most would have done." Leonard turned his gaze back to the road. His entire life had been built on power, wealth, control. And yet, when it mattered most, none of those things had been enough to protect the one person who truly mattered. He had spent years locked away in his mansion, drowning in regret, convinced that he had driven his daughter away. Now, standing here, he realized how much time he had wasted. He could not change the past, but he could ensure that the future was different. A soft sound from behind made him turn. His daughter, wrapped in a thick shawl, stood at the doorway. She was hesitant, watching him with cautious eyes. So much time lost between them. So many words unsaid. Leonard took a step forward, then another. She didn't retreat. That, at least, was something. His voice was quiet. "I never stopped looking for you." Her lips pressed together, her fingers clutching the fabric of the shawl tighter. She nodded, just once. And in that single nod, Leonard felt something inside him begin to mend. Michael, the boy who was now undeniably his grandson, peeked out from behind his mother's legs. Leonard crouched, offering the boy a hesitant smile. "I'd like to get to know you," he said, his voice hoarse. "If that's all right." Michael looked up at his mother for guidance. After a pause, she gave him the slightest nod. The child took a step closer, then another. A small, tentative hand reached for Leonard's, and when their fingers touched, Leonard felt for the first time in years something other than sorrow. Hope. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows that slowly dissolved in the growing light. A new day had begun. And for the first time in a long, long while, Leonard Whitmore was ready to step forward. The estate was eerily silent in the aftermath. The confrontation had ended, the ghosts of the past exorcised in the cold light of dawn. Leonard stood on the front steps, his hands trembling at his sides, staring at the worn path leading away from the towering gates. He had found her. His daughter was alive. She was inside, resting, her body battered but intact, her spirit fragile yet unbroken. The weight of years had lifted, but in its place was something heavier: responsibility. The search had ended, but the journey to healing had only begun. Evelyn stepped beside him, her arms wrapped around herself against the morning chill. "You did it," she said softly. "You found her." Leonard exhaled, the breath unsteady. "I don't know if I did anything at all." Evelyn gave him a knowing look. "You never gave up. That's more than most would have done." Leonard turned his gaze back to the road. His entire life had been built on power, wealth, control. And yet, when it mattered most, none of those things had been enough to protect the one person who truly mattered. He had spent years locked away in his mansion, drowning in regret, convinced that he had driven his daughter away. Now, standing here, he realized how much time he had wasted. He could not change the past, but he could ensure that the future was different. A soft sound from behind made him turn. His daughter, wrapped in a thick shawl, stood at the doorway. She was hesitant, watching him with cautious eyes. So much time lost between them. So many words unsaid. Leonard took a step forward, then another. She didn't retreat. That, at least, was something. His voice was quiet. "I never stopped looking for you." her lips pressed together, her fingers clutching the fabric of the shawl tighter. She nodded, just once. And in that single nod, Leonard felt something inside him begin to mend. Michael, the boy who was now undeniably his grandson, peeked out from behind his mother's legs. Leonard crouched, offering the boy a hesitant smile. "I'd like to get to know you," he said, his voice hoarse. "If that's all right." Michael looked up at his mother for guidance. After a pause, she gave him the slightest nod. The child took a step closer, then another. A small, tentative hand reached for Leonard's, and when their fingers touched, Leonard felt, for the first time in years, something other than sorrow. Hope. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows that slowly dissolved in the growing light. A new day had begun, and for the first time in a long, long while, Leonard Whitmore was ready to step forward.